The first thing to say about the Russian Revolution that started exactly 100 years ago, confusingly because of different calendars, it's known as the February Revolution, and that culminated in October 1917 in the seizure of power by the Soviets, the councils of workers' representatives led by the Bolshevik Party. The first thing to say about remembering this revolution 100 years later is that it's an orphan. If we compare the French Revolution, the bicentenary of the French Revolution took place in 1989, massive celebrations, the French president, God knows who else, all sorts of notables arriving to take note of and remember this great event. I'm old enough to remember the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution in 1967, and big celebrations in the Soviet Union, of course, because the regime was legitimized by October 1917, but even in the West, a sort of grudging acknowledgement. This revolution was a great event in human history and something that had to be understood in all sorts of ways as a progressive phenomenon. The situation is totally different today. There's an unwillingness to confront the revolution, and when people talk about it, they tend to dismiss it as a murderous aberration. I have this book, which I didn't pay for it, thank God. They sent it to me free, which is a collection on the revolution by the foremost historians of the revolution. And virtually all of the contributions say what a terrible thing the revolution was, how awful it was, how murderous it was, what a bastard Lenin was. I mean, there's one by a historian called Orlando Figis, who's actually a professor at Birkbeck down the road. He complains that the police didn't arrest Lenin on his way to the place where the revolution was being organized in October 1917. And he moans how if the police hadn't mistaken Lenin for a harmless drunk, then history would be completely different. And that's supposed to be academically serious history. Why do they hate the revolution of 1917? For a very simple reason. The elites worldwide, economic, political, academic, media, they are profoundly committed to the capitalist system because directly or indirectly they profit from it. And the great thing about the Russian Revolution of 1917 was here was a revolution that broke capitalism. Unfortunately only in one country, but it showed it could be done. It showed even in a poor and backward country in the midst of war, the working class could rise up, organize itself and take power. And of course they want us to forget it. Of course they want us to revile it and dismiss it. But it's extremely important to understand that revolution. Any socialist who doesn't see the revolution as a crucial reference point, not simply something to talk about as something that happened in the past, but as something that we can learn from today, in our struggles today, isn't really rising up to the challenge of taking on capitalism as a system. There are all sorts of specificities to the Russian Revolution. It took place, as I said, in a backward country, ruled by an absolutist monarchy, very high levels of repression. The majority of the population were peasants. All sorts of things that make Russia seem quite different from, say, Britain or the United States or wherever today. But it's much more important not to emphasize the differences. It's much more important to highlight the universality of the revolution. Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik Party, was one of the key leaders of the revolution. The other key leader was Trotsky, who actually organized the seizure of power in October 1917. And Trotsky wrote a magnificent book, The History of the Russian Revolution, which you should read. It's a masterpiece. And there are two things in particular he emphasizes. Firstly, he said capitalism doesn't develop in an even way. It creates a globalized system Marxists knew about globalization long before all the academics and boosters got onto the bandwagon back in the 1990s. Capitalism creates a global system, but it does so unevenly. It drags together different parts of the world and imposes its remorseless logic on them. This was true of Russia, Trotsky shows, before the revolution. Although the majority of the population were peasants, there were centers of advanced industrialization, and what exploded from those centres in the 20 years before the revolution was a militant working class that showed in 1905, the first revolution, a capacity to overthrow the Tsarist monarchy. Secondly, Trotsky addressed or showed how the revolution addressed what is one of the main objections to revolution. One of the main objections to revolution is just that people aren't ready for it. They aren't capable of it. Most people have different kinds of conservative ideas or preoccupied simply with everyday survival, struggling through work, keeping a family together, and so on and so forth. They're just not up for revolution, for this total transformation of society. But as Judith said, revolution isn't an instantaneous event. It's not just something that happens one glorious day, say the 25th of October 1917, when the Soviets actually seized power through the instrument of the Bolsheviks and so on and so forth. Revolution is a process. It's something that unfolds in time. So, in the case of the events we're remembering today, what were they in February 1917? They were the collapse of the old regime. The old regime was falling apart because of its corruption, its incompetence. It was being battered to death by the fact that it was losing a tremendous and terrible war, and the population was turning against it. And then you had, amidst the decay of the regime and the divisions of the ruling class, this uprising, this magnificent uprising, led, as we've already heard, by women workers, that broke the regime. At that moment, most of the people who actually were involved in overthrowing the old regime went up for socialist revolution. As they formed the Soviets, the workers' councils, they weren't saying all power to the Soviets. They just wanted a move to essentially a fairer and more democratic regime. But what Trotsky argues is that in the months that follow, that culminate in the October Revolution, what in particular the workers do, the most advanced section of the oppressed and exploited population do, is test their options, try out their options. Trotsky talks about a method of successive approximation. In other words, they support different political solutions and see whether that solution will solve their problems. And essentially the solutions were different coalitions of the more moderate parties, the more progressive and democratic and liberal parties of the old regime, and the more moderate leftist parties. And as time goes on, the balance moves more and more to the left. What that reflects is a process of radicalization of the masses, because what the masses move to the left, they become more consciously revolutionary as they see that the solutions that they're trying aren't solving their problems. The problems that were summed up in the Bolshevik slogan of bread, land and peace. Feeding people. The peasants getting the land, taking it away from the landowners, and above all an end to the war. So you have this process of radicalization as the masses see that the moderate solutions, the compromises with the old order won't work. They won't solve their problems, not because they've read a book or pamphlet about it or heard a speech, but because they see their reality in their own lives. Now that is a feature of any revolution, that kind of process of radicalization. If we go back to the 1640s, the English Revolution, incidentally another revolution that they don't dare to think or talk about, just when we're getting, it's nice to think of another Charles being on the throne. when one remembers what happens to the first of that line. Again, you see it in the French Revolution, 1789 to 1794. We saw it in the Egyptian Revolution, to which Judith was an eyewitness at the start. So this process of radicalization goes on in all revolutions. But there were two crucial differences in 1917. Two things that stand out. First of all, that the working class created the Soviets, not for the first time. They'd already created them in the course of the revolution of 1905. And it's interesting, listening to the BA worker describing having to pay for your visa and things like that. It reminded me of what started the Soviets in 1905, which was the print workers. In those days, you typesetting wasn't, using a laptop or anything like that. Typesetting involved moving and putting together heavy lead and metal letters and so on and so forth. And the print workers were paid just for the letters, setting the letters, not for setting the punctuation marks. And they went on strike and laid the basis for the Soviets, created their own workers' committee because they wanted to be paid for punctuation marks. And before we know it, there was a general strike and a semi-insurrectionary situation raging in the cities of Russia. That shows how often quite small economic demands, in the right context, lead to workers taking enormous leaps forward. So the workers, first in 1905 and then in 1917, created the Soviets, created these radically democratic forms of self-organization that, and this is the crucial thing, worked not simply as organs of struggle to organize a strike, but could develop into organized organs of political power. What we saw in Russia in 1917 was a situation that Lenin called dual power, the coexistence of the provisional governments, these shaky coalitions attempting to hold together the existing order as best as possible, and confronting them, the Soviets representing the self-organized workers and soldiers. And this Soviet form we've seen again and again in revolutionary experiences since then. So that was one very important difference. The other difference is the Bolshevik Party. Because we look at the great revolutions, let's say the past 100 years, we've seen incredible experiences of mass struggle and inventiveness and so on. Too often, those movements are dominated by parties that want essentially to make a compromise with the old order. From the German Social Democratic Party, in the case of the German Revolution of November 1918, imagine a revolution led by the Labour Party and not under the kind of leadership represented by Jeremy Corbyn. More like, imagine Tony Blair leading a revolution and you can imagine the likely outcome. But again, if we go to the case of Egypt in 2011, between 2011 and 2013, the dominant party that emerges within the revolutionary process is the Muslim Brotherhood, again that wants to make a deal with the old order. In Russia in 1917 we have the Bolsheviks. We have a Marxist party rooted in the working class and coming out steeled by a long experience of struggle. One thing that wasn't said about Il-bung Choi, our comrade from South Korea who spoke this evening, is that several times in the 1990s he was in jail because of his role in building a revolutionary organization in South Korea. And there are a number of other comrades in his organization who went through that experience. The Bolsheviks had thousands of activists who'd been through that kind of experience. And that meant, even though they were a small minority at the start of the revolution in February 1917, they had the roots and connections and respect in the working class that allowed them, over the space of those 8 months, to win larger and larger sections of the population, and crucially of the working class, to an acceptance of the necessity of the Soviets taking power. Because the Bolshevik slogan was bread, land and peace, solving the most pressing problems of the masses, but the bottom line of that was all power to the Soviets. In other words, the way to solve these problems was for the working class, with the support of the army and the peasantry, to take power. And you have the revolution succeeding because of the convergence between those two forces. Yeah. Of course, and Lenin's role, wasn't as this evil genius, as this idiot at Birkbeck says. He was simply the element within the political leadership of the Bolshevik Party that had the clearest understanding of the logic of the situation and the strategy that was necessary for the revolution to succeed. Now, as Judith said, of course we know the revolution was eventually defeated. And it was defeated for a fundamental reason. This was a rising that broke capitalism in one country, but capitalism is a global system. The revolution could only succeed through a global revolution. Now, this wasn't something that the Bolsheviks hadn't noticed. We forgot about imperialism. We forgot about global capitalism. They understood that. They gambled on the crisis of humankind created by the First World War, leading to other revolutionary situations in more advanced countries. So they launched, after the revolution, the Communist International. They didn't just seek to build that international in the advanced capitalist countries. What Neyman was talking about is very, very important. One of the key meetings of the Communist International was in Baku, in Central Asia, a Muslim city, and the point of that Congress in 1920 was to launch a revolutionary movement throughout the colonial empires, because the Bolsheviks saw the colonized masses, who made up a majority of humankind then, as the key allies of the socialist revolution. So, if the Bolsheviks failed, they didn't fail for want of trying. They attempted to spread the revolution, but they failed. And we need to come back to that understanding. There are no national solutions to our problems. At the minute, we have these right-wing politicians who often say quite plausible things about what a terrible thing globalization is. Trump, Le Pen, the rest of them, Wilders, and so on and so forth. What's their solution? Going back to the nation state. The nation state is the best framework for achieving human happiness, Trump said a few weeks ago. Are you joking? The nation state that has brought us war after war, that has been a central part of the way in which capitalism has oppressed and divided humankind, that's going to solve our problems? The only way to solve our problems is through international revolution. And we can be sure there will be more revolutionary breakthroughs. There will be more upsurges. We can't say when, where, and in what form. A few years before the revolution in Tunisia, I was in Tunis at an academic conference. And, I have to say, I had no idea that this country would see a mass revolution. I looked at my hosts and I thought, no, there's nothing much is going to happen here. Which shows what brilliant predictors, what brilliant prophets Marxists can be. So you can't tell where revolutions can take place. But one thing you can be sure is that for revolution to succeed, there has to be something like the Bolshevik Party. There has to be revolutionary Marxist organization that connects a Marxist understanding with of the world with real struggles and movements, above all the struggles of the organized working class. And we can do something about that. That's what we're trying to do in the Socialist Workers' Party. That's what Il-bung and his comrades are trying to do in South Korea. In preparation for March the 18th isn't just a British event. There are going to be protests all over, not just Europe, but in other parts of the world as well. And if you look at who's organising those demonstrations, along with lots of other people, very often it's our comrades, people with the same politics as us. So it's necessary to build revolutionary socialist organisation, not outside the struggle, but as part of the struggle. And if you think that's worthwhile, join us. Join the Socialist Workers' Party. Join our sister organisations in other countries. And let's remember why the ruling classes hate Lenin, hate Trotsky, hate the Bolsheviks, hate the October Revolution, is because it let out the most dangerous secret of all. Capitalism can be overthrown, and if it happened once, it can happen again.